a figure here in South Africa, a person that has given advice since 1998. He's been part of the type of thinking, focusing on the borrowing powers of local government, but in general, what's happening in local government finances. I want to introduce Matt because I think most of us that have encountered him over the years do not know his background. So please allow me to just quickly and briefly introduce him. He's studied law and has worked in a number of countries, and I'm going to quickly mention those countries to you: Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Swaziland, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Jordan, and the Philippines, to assist with local and intergovernmental finances. He started his professional career as a municipal bond counsel, in other words, in American terms, like a municipal bond legal person for the South Africans. He's been the director for Municipal Law and Finance at the Center for Urban Law and Finance in Africa. He serves as a member of the International Advisory Committee on the Center for Land Governance and the Indian Institute of Human Settlements. He's an extraordinary research fellow of the South African chair in the city's law and environmental sustainability at the Northwest University Faculty of Law. He's been a lead urban specialist at the World Bank, where he's managed programs in Africa and India. Matt Glasser has worked for the Treasury, as I've mentioned to you guys, for the past 24 years, and is a specialist on local government finances, but especially municipal borrowing and financial emergencies. Matt, we are most honored to have you here with us this afternoon. I know that there will be an interesting presentation from your side. I look forward to that, and I look forward to still continue to have your insight and wisdom with us here in South Africa. We see you intermittently. We can see you more regularly, I feel. But welcome this afternoon, and please share with us some of your views and insights. It is a rich, rich experience that Matt is bringing to the table for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Renette, and hello, everybody. Let me turn off my camera and turn on my presentation and see how well that works. Okay, does everybody see the title slide now?
Yes, I can see it, Matt. Yes.
Okay, good. Well, again, thanks, Renette, and it's a pleasure to be here. I do love South Africa. My wife is South African, and I spend a lot of time here, and she's not hesitant to tell me what I've got wrong. So please, I expect the same of all of you. Take anything I say with a grain of salt and feel free to correct me. The way I want to get into the questions today is by starting out defining our terms. What is a municipality and what do they do? And I think if you've not worked in other countries, you may take the South African model as being sort of typical of the world. And let me assure you that it's not. Each country is different. And one way to better understand our South African municipalities is to consider how they're like and how they're different what we see in other countries. The word itself means different things in different countries. Here we call all local government municipalities. In many places, a municipality means a denser, specific thing like a city. And you would call the rural municipality, what we here call rural municipalities, something else. You might call them, in Kenya, for instance, a district. Tanzania, Uganda, same thing. They've got urban local governments and they've got districts. But broadly speaking, here in South Africa, we have wall-to-wall municipalities, and they have the same powers and functions as one another within a few limits. As you know, there's three types of municipalities. There's the local municipality, there's the district municipality, which typically comprises 4 or 5 locals, and then there's the metros, which have the powers and functions of both the local and the district municipalities. What is a municipality? One way to think about it is that it's a corporate entity, like a corporation. And it's a corporation in which essentially the citizens are the shareholders. And those shareholders elect a board of directors, which we call the municipal council. And then the municipal council hires a CEO that we call the municipal manager. And broadly speaking, corporate governance principles also apply to municipalities. And the King Commission here in South Africa, in its most recent report, King 4, specifically included an appendix on how governance principles applicable to corporations apply specifically to municipalities. And that's worth looking at if you've not come across that. So one way to think about the municipality is it's a corporate entity. Another way to think about it, and this appears in legislation, is that the municipality is also the community. It's the people that live in the municipality, that work in the municipality, that visit the municipality. That is also the municipality. And a third way to think about it is it's a physical space with boundaries. So the municipality of Swane abuts the municipality of Johannesburg, abuts the municipality of Ekurhuleni, and they all fit together across the country, kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. So these municipalities are these places, they're these corporate entities, and they're the collection of people within them. And then the powers and functions, I think, are also an interesting set of questions. Here in South Africa, maybe the most important powers and functions of municipalities are to provide the built environment, the streets, the roads, the sidewalks, the electricity, the water service, the sewage, the rubbish disposal. They provide the services that make a city and the people in it happy, healthy, and functional if it's doing its job. But they don't in South Africa do things like provide hospitals and schools, which in many other countries municipalities do. If you look at, let's say Tanzania, for example, the municipalities there are responsible for primary education, primary health care, but they're not responsible for water, sewer, or electric. So when you try to compare municipalities in different countries, you'll often find that they do very different things. So it's always important to start with what do we think they're supposed to be doing? And then because this presentation is about municipal finance, obviously we have to talk about where municipalities get their money. Taxes and fees are, of course, the most important. And in South Africa, the most important tax is the property tax. The property tax is very common in English-speaking countries. It's common in, it's what's primarily the source of municipal revenue in the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Ireland, and curiously also in the Netherlands. It exists in other countries, but it's not the biggest source of revenues. Many countries' local governments get a significant source of revenues from a business tax. And here in South Africa, there's currently not a business tax for municipalities. There used to be in the form of the RSC levy, but it had some constitutional problems, and so it was abolished and replaced with the fuel levy transfer, which is problematic in many ways. One thing that happens when you don't have a business tax fueling local government is the municipality tends not to care enough about the business environment in its community. In countries where municipalities have a business tax, they spend a lot of their time and energy thinking about how to help their businesses grow and prosper because of the revenue it provides. But of course, as these businesses grow and prosper, they also provide jobs and productivity and economic development. So one thesis that I offer to you is that the lack of a business-based source of revenue for municipalities in South Africa is partially accountable for the disconnect between the operating environment for productive enterprises and the city. There are also transfers that come to municipalities, and there's two basic kinds of transfers here in South Africa for municipalities that come from national government. There's the equitable share. And the purpose of the equitable share originally, I know a lot of people now say it's to provide free basic services, but that wasn't the origin of it in theory. The theory was, okay, we're going to have a property tax, And we're also going to have fees for water and electric. And rich people will be able to pay those. So in municipalities that are relatively richer, municipalities will get lots of income. But in poor and rural municipalities where there's not a lot of wealth and where there's not a lot of, therefore, tax revenue, we need to equalize it somehow because they've still got the same powers and functions as the richer municipalities. So the theory is we'll give them an equalizing revenue called the equitable share, which is broadly based on poverty and population. So that if you've got more people, you get a higher equitable share. If you've got more poverty, you get a higher equitable share. The metro municipalities, if we go back to, let's say, let's go back to 2000 because that's when the current municipalities took their form after the municipal elections in December of 2000. At that stage, all of the metros were generating over 90% of their own revenues. And the municipal sector as a whole was contributing over 80% of its own revenues. Both of those numbers have fallen since, as national transfers have increased and increased and increased. And there are two kinds of transfers that municipalities get from the National Treasury. There's this unconditional equitable share that the municipal council can spend on any legitimate municipal purpose. It's completely up to the council in consultation with the community how they spend that, as is the property tax. And then there's these conditional transfers, which were never part of the original architecture for municipal finance in South Africa. They've grown exponentially over the years, starting with about 2007, when we were in the run-up to the 2010 World Cup. And national government decided that municipalities must build stadiums and they must build bus rapid transit systems and they must do it quickly. So we will give them money to do that. And the number and type of municipal grants has just since then continued to flower and grow. And a problem, in my view, with these conditional grants is that they change the municipality's thinking. The municipality is no longer thinking, what do we need here in this municipality? What do our citizens want? What can we do that will provide a healthy climate for economic growth? Instead, they ask themselves, what can we get money from national government for? What are the hoops we must jump through? What are the reports we must write? And that goes back to this origin again with the bus rapid transit and the stadiums. The cities built stadiums, and a lot of them are now white elephants. And then they come back to the national government saying, okay, you made us build these things, now help us maintain them. And in a way, that's right, because it wasn't really the municipal idea in the first place. It was a national policy goal. So I think, you know, a second thesis that I offer to you is that this explosion of conditional grants has diverted the entire municipal management and municipal planning and municipal capacity to thinking, how do we satisfy the national grant receiving and grant reporting machine, which is quite extraordinary. And they have forgotten, in a way, what they actually need in the city. Let me go on with that, actually. This is a good point to get into this slide. You know, there are lots of problems with South Africa's economy. And I think, as I said, this lack of a business tax is an important piece of it. Another important piece of it, and I think we'll have time to get into this a little later, is the role that political parties play at the local level in South Africa, which is, again, somewhat unique to South Africa. You've certainly read stories about the Astral Poultry facility in Standerton, which is part of Lekwa municipality, which threatened to shut down because they weren't getting adequate municipal services. And you've seen the stories about Clover Dairy, which had to shut down its cheese processing plant in Northwest Province because, again, the roads were potholed, the electricity was unreliable, the water's unreliable. And I want you to think about what effect this failure of municipal services in so many of the intermediate cities in South Africa has on the national economy. When one of these factories closes, it's not only the hundreds of jobs that are lost. It's also all the people in the community that used to serve those employed workers. The local butcher, the local farmers, the local barber, the repairman, the gardener, whoever relied indirectly on income from those factories also loses out. So context matters, but one of the important contexts in South Africa, I think, is that the collapse of services in so many municipalities has led to a real economic crisis for South Africa. This is a graph that the IMF put out earlier this year. And I want to take a minute to explain what this is. This is the median GDP per capita. In other words, on average, how much is the average South African producing compared to the rest of the world? That darkest line is South Africa. And you see that in 2000, we started off slightly behind the rest of the world. But by 2003, we crossed over. And from 2005 through maybe 2000, we were outpacing the rest of the world. South Africans were on average getting more productive than the rest of the world. And then the 2008 financial crisis happened, and affected South Africa and the rest of the world. You see that big dip there. But after the 2008 financial crisis, the rest of the world took off. Economic growth continued. And South Africa initially took off slowly and then plateaued and then started diving seriously down and continuing to drop to the point right now where South Africa is at the 25th percentile compared to productivity in the rest of the world. So again, before 2008, the average South African was as productive as anyone else in the world. Now, the average South African is half as productive as the average in the rest of the world, and that number is continuing to fall. This is the most depressing slide I think I will show you today, but I'm showing it to you for a reason. This horrible decline in relative productivity is in large part due to the financial mismanagement of many of the cities, many of the municipalities. And it's not something that's happened from external causes. This isn't due to the 2008 financial crisis anymore. This isn't due to Ukraine. This isn't due to COVID. This is due to the way South Africa has been managing its municipalities. And you may ask why I'm saying municipalities. Remember that every single productive space in South Africa is in some municipality. The industrial production largely happens in the metros and some of the bigger secondary municipalities. The agricultural production happens in more rural municipalities. But in every municipality that fails to build enough infrastructure for growth and development, that fails to maintain its existing infrastructure, that suffers electricity outages and water shortages, and that pollutes the streams with untreated sewage. That's because of what we're doing here in South Africa. That's not something somebody else has done to us. And it's happened in a fairly short time, since 2008. The fact that it's happened in a fairly short time means that it can also be reversed in a fairly short time if we can get these municipalities back to financial health. The title that the IMF put on this graph, and I cut it off here on the top just to make it fit on the slide, the title was Stagnation, Past, Present, and Future. And the subtitle was South Africa has suffered from long-running income stagnation compared to the rest of the world. I want you to sit with this graph for a while. The problems that this graph represents are problems of productivity. They will not be solved by national government with all of its programming. They will be solved at the municipal level by municipalities that take it upon themselves to restore a climate in which businesses can prosper, people can work, people can earn a living, and so on. let me go back to this theme now. What is a municipality? We said earlier, it's a corporate entity. It's a community of people, and it's an area defined by boundaries. But I suggest to you that those are technical answers. But conceptually, a municipality is at least two more things. A municipality is an engine of production, and a municipality is a labor market. When we think about the city as an engine of production, we need to think about it like we would any other engine. We need to make sure it has enough fuel. We need to make sure that it's running smoothly. We need to make sure that it's connected to the drive wheels. And our South African municipalities driving around today, how much additional time did I spend stopping at every non-working stoplight so that people could take turns going through? How much time did I spend this morning trying to be sure that I would have electricity for the Wi-Fi for the presentation that I'm giving now? All of these frustrations with services are reflected in the dropping productivity. Now, the other thing that a city is it's a labor market. We all know the history of apartheid, and what the apartheid government did was it deliberately separated workers from jobs. And ever since then, we've been trying to figure out how to reconnect workers to jobs. If there's one thing that municipalities absolutely must get right, it's connecting workers with jobs, and that largely means transportation. I know there's a lot of talk about moving jobs to townships and so on. And in bigger townships like Soweto and so on, maybe that can happen. It has happened. But in so many places in the secondary, you've still got the white side of town and the black side of town, and the people who have to commute to very long rides and very expensive rides, and it makes them uneconomical for them to contribute to the productivity of the country.
Matt,
Renette, I see you raising your hand.
Would you put your camera down? Maybe it will help with your bandwidth. Your camera is still showing.
I see. Are there problems with the transmission?
It's a little bit wobbly. It's getting a little bit wobbly. But if you put your camera, your bandwidth will be, your demand will be less on bandwidth.
Oh. Now, I do want to compare a little bit South African municipalities and powers and functions with those in a few other countries that I've worked in. Not all, but just to give you an idea. You see, in all of these four countries that I've shown here, there are two different kinds of local government. And in fact, in some countries, there are more. In South Africa, we've already said that there are also metros. But the way they're divided differs. In Indonesia and in India, you have this very sharp division between urban local government and rural or district local governments, panchayats in India. In South Africa, it looks at first glance like you might have the same thing, but it's not, because you actually have two-level local government. Every place outside the 8 metros, there are 2 levels of local government. We like to talk about 3 spheres of government, but the fact is the local sphere is divided, and a lot of the inefficiency that happens in the local sphere happens because of overlap and dysfunction in the way the local and the district are connected. The argument about locals versus districts goes back at least, to when I was first working here in 1998, and they were writing the Municipal Systems Act, and they had to decide which powers and Structures Act, which powers and functions go to which municipalities. And there were tensions between different people working on these policies. Some people said, most of the capacity to deliver services is in the local governments, in the former, white little towns. Other people said, yeah, but that's exactly the problem. We want them now to serve the surrounding area, so we have to give more power to the districts. And it was a problem that's never really resolved. And there was a quick study that was done in 2000 that was intended to try and answer this question. But But still, there's no uniformity in the way water service is provided across the country, and there's not a lot of good connectivity between the district and the local government. In places where you have the local government providing the water, the sewer, the electric, what the district's function is basically to coordinate between local municipalities, and therefore they have a very high staff budget and a very low budget that goes into actually providing services. So anytime one tries to make global statements about municipal finances in South Africa, you have to keep in mind whether you're talking about district municipalities or local municipalities, and if you're talking about local municipalities, are you talking about those with water service authority or not with water service authority? Let me offer you some benchmarks that I think are interesting. If you look, and now I've got 5 countries on the slide. South Africa has 58 million people. It's sort of in the same size range as Saudi Arabia, but it's much smaller than the US, a sixth the size, much smaller than Indonesia, a fifth the size, and very much smaller than India with its 1.3 billion people. In GDP per capita, you're in the mid-range. At 6,000 and change US dollars per capita, you're well ahead of India, you're ahead of Indonesia, you're behind Saudi, and you're about a tenth of the US. I heard a little feedback just there. Is there a problem with the sound again?
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay, good. The structure of the countries is also different. You know, South Africa has its 3 spheres, and in that sense, it's somewhat decentralized, but it's still a unitary state, and the national government has powers over a lot more things than it would have in a federal country like the US or India, where the states have a great deal more power than the national government. Indonesia is also a unitary system, and Saudi Arabia is unique on this chart in that it's got a monarchy, and the monarchy involves itself in everything down to the local level. If I look at broadly the characteristics of the municipalities, I would have to say that South Africa is a very strong municipal government system. The municipalities in South Africa, in terms of the Constitution, Structures Act, Systems Act, SPLUMA, Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, have a great deal of power over how they spend their money, how they decide on land use issues, how they decide to provide services. In that sense, kind of comparable to the United States. And in terms of recent political developments, they're kind of comparable to Indonesia. On the other hand, India has very, very weak local governments, and so does Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabian governments are basically responsible for transport and transit, and that's pretty much it. They don't have anything to do with water or electricity or sewage. India, they may not even provide all of the streets. India attempted in 1974 to do a decentralization that would move a lot more power to the local governments. But because that required the states to give up power, and especially because it required states to give up power over land use, it hasn't gone very far. But I want you to look at this chart specifically for a second, comparing India and South Africa. South Africa, per capita, has 3 times the resources to spend that India does. And yet India is heading back to 7 and 8% growth. And if you go to India today, you see cranes everywhere, you see construction everywhere, you see state-of-the-art metros being built in all the main cities. They've still got serious problems with water in many places. They're solving their national transport problems. So sometimes people will ask, well, is there enough money in the South African system? And, you know, one answer is there's never, ever enough money. People always would like to do more. But again, South Africa has a great deal of money compared to India, but India is achieving record-breaking growth and productivity, and South Africa is continuing to drop relative to its peers. And I do think a lot of that has to do with municipalities and their financial management. Let's talk about the two main things that cities spend their money on. Operational revenues and expenditures and infrastructure financing. So when we talk operational, we're talking about running the existing water system, running the existing street system, bus system, whatever it is that the city is running. It collects revenues from some of those things. It doesn't collect revenues from others, but must pay for them out of the property tax or equitable share. And in addition, if there's been any borrowing to construct infrastructure, to buy things, then you have to be paying off your loans. And that we call that debt service. The debt service includes paying back the capital, plus it includes the annual interest. That operational funding takes up most of cities' budgets these days. In South Africa, as in every other country, when money gets tight, what cities do is they tend to cut their infrastructure financing. And while that's understandable as a reaction to a tight financial situation, it's also giving away the future. And one of the big problems we've had in South Africa is that municipalities are not spending enough on infrastructure financing. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of the countries in Eastern Europe, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, were far behind their Western European counterparts in terms of the quality of infrastructure. And so municipalities in those countries regularly spent 30% of their budget on infrastructure. In South Africa, sometimes you find municipalities that are spending 1 or 2% of their budget on infrastructure. The best are maybe accomplishing 15% of their budget on infrastructure. But you can see if you're competing in a world where other people are building infrastructure to serve a growing population and to serve a growing economy, you're going to fall behind. We'll get into the borrowing framework in just a little bit here, but at the time democracy came to South Africa, one of the recognitions was the national government did not have enough money to build all the local infrastructure that was needed in the country, and they would never have enough money to build this infrastructure. South Africa at the time that democracy came was deeply in debt, and a lot of the early years of effort at National Treasury were trying to dig out from under that debt load. And unfortunately, we're back to a situation where the government, the national government, is having to again borrow money in order to fund deficits. And that means that there's less money for transfers to local governments. So whose responsibility is it then to build infrastructure? The approach that the Constitution took and the approach that the 1998 white paper on local government took was to say, we will be sure that the municipalities have enough revenue streams through things like property tax and equitable share, that they can meet their financial obligations, and we will put the burden on them to borrow for infrastructure. And that means that each municipality needs to decide for itself what's the right balance between operations and infrastructure. You shouldn't be building infrastructure if you can't maintain it. And so any council always has to keep that in mind. There are many countries where national government takes the responsibility for financing infrastructure, and then local governments are meant to maintain it. And uniformly in those countries, local governments don't maintain it. They just let it go to heck because they figure if we need to, we'll get more money for infrastructure financing from the national government. So my experience in the world has taught me it's really important that the operation and the infrastructure be funded by the same entity, that the money come from the same source, and that the people who are accountable for it have to solve this simultaneous equation of how to allocate between infrastructure financing and operational financing. I'll just run through these slides quickly because I think I've said most of this already. When we look at the revenue side of the budget, we look at taxes. The most important is the property tax. I regret that South Africa doesn't have a business tax, but it doesn't. Many countries have a local sales tax. We don't have that here. Municipalities also get money from the fees they charge for water and sewer. Those are not usually money-making operation. They get a lot of revenue from it, but they also have to pay a lot of money out the other side for bulk services. So municipalities buy their water from a water board. They buy their electricity from ESCOM. Some of them are now going to start buying from independent power producers, but either way, they have a cost for that component, and they can cover that with their fees, but they're not going to make a big profit on it. Connection fees are something that in many countries is used more aggressively than it is in South Africa. What that says is the municipality has spent a lot of money to build water capacity, let's say, and you're now going to want to connect to that. So you're going to use up a chunk of the capacity that we've created. You need to repay us for the capital cost we've invested and the interest cost that we've carried for all these years now that you're going to connect to it. And what that does is it shifts the burden from the municipality onto the developer. So the development must pay its own way. The way it works in many South African municipalities, especially the intermediate cities, is those costs are just absorbed by the city. So if the city has built a piece of capital infrastructure, it will recover the cost slowly over many years from the users, not from the developers. And that means that the users' tariffs go up to cover the capital cost to serve new users. So you're recovering more from the poor and from existing users and less from those who are instigating new development. You know, when a new shopping center, a new hotel, a new office building goes in, the practice in some other countries is you get the fee for connection right at that time, and then you're out of financing that bit of infrastructure. We've talked about unconditional and conditional transfers. On the expenditure side, a tremendous amount of money gets spent on salaries and things that are incidental to salaries, like pension contributions, medical contributions, unemployment insurance. There's always supplies, chemicals for the water treatment plant and the sewer plant, road paving materials, concrete, iron, all sorts of supplies. There's the regular O&M expenditures, and then there's the debt service if you've taken out a loan. And the things that qualify as capital expenditure, the things that qualify as investments, are sort of in a separate budget for capital, and that applies to things like buildings or vehicles, streets, parks, any other property, plant, and equipment. On this slide, I want to talk about something that is really a little fuzzy and hard to talk about. But as you go around again and you look at from one country to the next, you often have different people answer the question, what is a local government, differently. And I think my experience is that in those countries where local government does best, there is a shared and coherent understanding and model of local governments, of local governance. And that model involves the active participation by citizens in selecting the capital investments, in deciding along with the city council how they're going to be financed, how they're going to be repaid if a loan must be taken. It involves citizens sitting on parks committees and building committees and long-term planning committees and zoning committees. Citizens actively participating in these because they care about their city. In most intermediate cities in, let's say, the United States, council members don't earn a salary. They maybe get $100 a month for an honorarium, but nobody makes a career out of being a city councilor. You become a city councilor because you want to help your city. In the big cities in the US, that's not so. There are professional city councilors in places like New York and Chicago. But in the smaller intermediate cities, that's not the case. How do people perceive the roles and responsibilities of local government versus national government? How do people perceive the roles of politicians versus the citizens' roles? What's the role of local government compared to other institutions of government? What's the role of the executive compared to the judiciary? in this country, in South Africa, we've had the judiciary come out fairly strongly on a couple of cases in terms of what municipalities can and cannot do. But it's nothing compared to the Indian Supreme Court, which regularly orders that specific things be done. The legal and financial tools that are available to you depend on the political culture. A lot of times people might say, well, why don't we copy the way they do this in the Netherlands, or the way they do this in Canada, or the way they do this in Europe or the US? It won't work. Tools that are useful in a different culture and a different context can give you ideas, but you can't just cut and paste. They won't work the same way in different cultures. And for years, development institutions have been going around talking about best practices. That is very hard to find, and it's even harder to import into a different context. Let me give you an example of the interaction between governance culture and governance institutions. I want to compare institutional accountability here between the Chicago Water Board and the Johannesburg water situation. In Chicago, water is provided by the city itself. They have a sewer board which is separate from the city, but the drinking water is provided by the city itself. The mayor is directly elected by all of the citizens. And moreover, each of the 55 aldermen, which is what they call their city councilors, is directly elected by the people in their specific ward. The mayor then appoints a department head. So if a citizen is unhappy with service at any point, they go to the mayor, who can raise hell with the department head, or they go to their alderman, who can also raise hell with either the mayor or the department head. There's not much distance. There's not a lot of communication links between the citizens and the person responsible for services. There is absolutely no performance or service delivery agreement. I know in this country there's so much attention paid to these performance agreements. But the problem is you can define performance to only a certain degree in a contract, and people can punch that performance indicator. They can achieve that performance indicator without achieving good service or good delivery. And yet, despite the fact there's no performance or service delivery agreement, there's consistently very good performance. Chicago has some of the best water in the world. And it has that because if it didn't, people would raise a problem. Now compare that with Johannesburg. Look how drawn out the accountability is here. The citizens vote for actually a political party. They don't really vote for a municipal council. Half the seats are directly elected and the other half are party list seats. But even the people who are directly elected typically belong to a party. You know, they belong to the ANC or the EFF or the DA. And they are accountable to their party for how they vote and how they make decisions. And party discipline is real. So when you're voting for the ANC list, you're not actually voting for an individual who's going to be your counselor. You're voting for a set of candidates that have been selected, in the case of the ANC, in Luthuli House. You're voting for a mayor who will be selected by those counselors according to that mayor's ability to serve national political interests. And I'm not picking on the ANC. It's the same with the other major political parties here. The deployment of mayors and managers is according to what serves the political party, and perhaps according to that individual's ability to raise money for that political party. And it's not because you know this guy, he's down the street from you, and he's going to work to serve you well. That in the case of Joburg, then they've got these separate entities. So the mayor or manager then deals with the board of directors of the water entity. And that water entity then has a separate managing director. And then that separate managing director has a department head. So if a citizen's got a problem, the chance of getting that resolved through this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 link chain of communication back and forth is tiny. It will not work. And this drawn out accountability, this lack of direct accountability by council members and mayors to their citizens, I think is one of the biggest problems. That's my third thesis. That's one of the bigger problems affecting South Africa's municipal situation. I'm now going to change topics entirely. I've got about maybe 10 minutes more of presentation, and then I'd like to get into discussion. And I'm thinking, let me go ahead and go through the borrowing presentation, and then we can have.
Call you to order then. Okay.
I'm sorry, say again, Ronette?
I'm saying fine. Please go ahead with the 10 minutes still,
okay.
And then we'll open for discussions. Thanks.
Okay. So borrowing in municipal finance. The role of borrowing in creating capital infrastructure almost cannot be overstated. Companies borrow to build things. Cities borrow to build things. And they have to keep ahead of the curve. You can't wait until a guy wants to open a factory and then say, okay, now we'll go build a water treatment plant. You always have to have the capacity to serve the citizens, the growing population, the capacity to serve new businesses and firms that want to come into the community and start a manufacturing or production operation. And you have to be investing also in replacement or rehabilitating facilities that have reached the end of their useful life. Here are the principles that apply to good municipal borrowing practices. And let's distinguish between short-term borrowing, which you might do because you're expecting your conditional grant later in the year, but you need to build something now, and long-term borrowing, which spans more than the current year. You borrow only to finance capital investment, not to support the budget. In this morning's presentation that GCR Ratings had about the state of municipal finances, I was surprised by the number of people who were questioning this principle. But to me, and people call this the golden rule. If you are borrowing to support your budget, then you're going to borrow again next year to support the budget, and the year after that to support the budget, and your debt will continue to grow year after year until you become completely insolvent. So borrowing is only for capital investment, and it doesn't have to be capital investment that generates a profit per se, but it has to be borrowing for capital investment that is for the good of the community, whether that's economic or culturally or recreationally. The term of borrowing should ideally match the asset life. We're nowhere near that in South Africa. Currently, most municipal loans are sort of in the 7 to 10 to 15 year range. Even 15 is getting harder and harder to find. Whereas a lot of municipal assets, a water treatment plant or a highway, a bridge, they may have 30 to 50 year useful lives. If you finance the infrastructure over the longest period that makes sense in terms of the asset, then you're allowing future users over many years to pay for it. If you don't borrow, that means you're going to have to pay for all the infrastructure you're going to need for the next 20 or 30 years now, and that's never affordable. Having said that, borrowing is not a revenue stream. It's not an alternative source of funds. It's not instead of taxes. It in fact uses up your tax revenue. If you borrow money today, you're going to have to pay it back tomorrow and next year and the year after out of your revenues. So borrowing represents a claim on future revenues. For a municipal council to decide to borrow means that they are inherently limiting the choices of the next municipal council and the one after that. So it's critically important that they borrow wisely and spend the money on things that are really useful. The basic principle behind South Africa's municipal borrowing regulations is we want to encourage creditworthiness. And there's not time today to get into all the factors that affect creditworthiness, but basically it's a measure of your ability to repay. We don't want to see municipalities that are not able to repay borrowing money. That's a disaster. We do want to see municipalities that are able to pay use their creditworthiness, their borrowing capacity in order to build the economic infrastructure that we need. Creditworthiness depends on a lot of things. It depends on the relationship between your revenues and expenditures, but it also depends on good management, including financial management. And if you're sort of a sketchy borrower, you should be paying more for credit than a good borrower, a well-managed borrower, because you want to use those pricing signals to influence people to become better, cities, municipalities to become better managed. The laws and regulations that South Africa has set up in the Municipal Finance Management Act, and in fact, even in the Constitution, are neutral. They don't say thou shalt borrow, they don't say thou shalt not borrow. They say you can borrow, but only for capital investment, and it's up to the council in consultation with the community to decide whether that's appropriate. So the advantages of borrowing are you can get more infrastructure more quickly for those three purposes I mentioned before: to extend services, to rehabilitate or replace aging facilities, and to support economic development. Another advantage is this business I pointed that you can pay for it over the 50 years. You don't have to have current taxpayers pay for everything. And a final point is that autonomous borrowing supports decentralization. Again, you have this question of, do municipalities actually need stadiums and BRTs, or did they more need other things? Each local government should be able to decide that for itself. A warning, I've got it here under cons. Borrowing can never substitute for balanced budgets. You can never borrow your way out of financial trouble. In fact, if you're going to borrow as a municipality, you should have an operating surplus. You should be bringing more money in than you need to spend on operations. That's called an operating surplus, because that's where your debt service comes from. That's your ability to afford to borrow. When you borrow, I said a moment ago, it limits the flexibility of future councils. And just as borrowing can make good choices better, it can also make bad choices worse. If you decide to build a new showy home for the mayor, that's not going to help you culturally, recreationally, socially, or economically. And you're going to be paying for it. So you need to be careful about what you borrow for. The municipal borrowing ecosystem includes creditworthy borrowers, and in South Africa, we still have many of these, not as many as we'd like, but 5 of the 8 big metros are still quite creditworthy. I would say there's at least a dozen intermediate cities, maybe twice that are creditworthy. And more could be if more attention was paid to financial management. There is, in fact, no reason that any municipality in South Africa should not be creditworthy. It's a question of the political will to insist that they follow the rules and that they don't spend money they don't have. The investors and lenders that lend to municipalities are also important. Currently, the DBSA dominates this space, and the DBSA is essentially playing with government money. So it's the same problem we had at the start of the democratic era, which is government isn't going to be able to pay for all the infrastructure. The basic goal of the municipal borrowing framework for South Africa was to mobilize the very large amounts of private capital that are in South Africa for the public good. At the end of apartheid, we recognized that South Africans, rich South Africans, had large stores of capital, which they could either move offshore and invest in other countries, or which they could devote to building public infrastructure for the economic development and social development of South Africa. And so the borrowing framework was intended to mobilize private sector capital for public infrastructure. And we've only been about half successful with that effort. Part of the reason it hasn't been more successful is what I mentioned earlier about this explosion of conditional grants, which took municipalities' eye off the ball and focused them on how do we get free money from national government. Another part of it is the dominance of the DBSA, which has continued to lend, despite that it's called the Development Bank, it's continued to lend to the most creditworthy, the best credit risks in South Africa, and that doesn't leave space for the private capital. We developed a legal and regulatory framework which was intended to balance the rights of the borrowers and the lenders, and for many years it was the envy of the world. People all over the world, other countries, were emulating the South African borrowing framework. Lately that's slowed down a bit because of the state of South African municipalities. They say, okay, if this is such hot stuff, how come the municipalities are in such difficult situations? And maybe this is where I'll stop, just to say that if you want municipal borrowing for infrastructure from the private sector to succeed, municipalities must have good revenue authority. And they have that in the property tax. I wish they also had it in the in the business tax. You have to have good financial management, and that's one of the big weaknesses in South Africa. You've all seen the Auditor General's report. Only, I think in the last year, 16% of municipalities got clean audit reports. You have to have borrowing authority. In South Africa, you've got that. Borrowing is a local decision. It doesn't get interfered with by national government. You have to be able to give lenders a reasonable amount of security that their money's safe. You have to have remedies for creditors in case the municipality defaults. And you have to have a good set of rules for resolving financial problems in municipalities. And here again, this is an area where many countries have tried to copy the regime that is set out in the South African law. But here in South Africa itself, politicians have been reluctant to intervene, even in the cases where the law says they must intervene. And like, for example, in Lekwa, you know, the chicken producer Astral Poultry had to go to court to compel the national government to intervene as required by law. I think I'm going to wrap right here. I guess I just want to say one more time that South Africa has gotten into this problem through its own decisions and through its own efforts. And South Africa can get out of this problem through its own efforts. And it doesn't take rocket science to figure out what needs to be done. It really just takes political leadership and the willing to do what needs to be done. And so, Renette, if I may, with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Matt. Maybe you want to put your camera on again so that we can have a nice chat with you. Thank you very much for this for me, in a way, a reminder of what we have achieved, what we were able to do, but how things have also gone a bit south, you know, how we need to pick up again and find the fixes. Matt, for me, it felt like a real serious reminder is how I feel about it, you know, sort of to see it comprehensively and discussed in this way. I want to open it up for questions. So just put your hand up here on the chat, and let's see. I'll deal with the questions as they come up. Perhaps I'm going to sort of start, Matt, and just a little bit hear your view on the fact that we do have, in many ways, quite an active citizenry in South Africa. They sort of, you know, people are vocal and people are able to stand up, and there's a lot of unrest, as we would call it, in the township areas, in informal settlement areas. But somehow this is not landed. Somehow those moments of upsetness and community action, etc., are not articulated back into serious, sustainable responses. I just keep on wondering why. Why, when we have got some of the strongest, as you say, set of laws and functions for municipalities, are we not using it? What do you think is going wrong? And then perhaps we'll get some more people to join you and me in this conversation.
You know, I've just finished reading a book, the approximate title of which is The Time Before, What Comes Before Radical Change, by a guy named Gal Beckerman. And he goes into things as early as the 1830s Chartist movement in the UK and as recent as the Proud Boys and Trump in the US. And, you know, in some of his discussion, he points out that nothing just starts from scratch. It always has antecedents in history. And that people who want to really make change look for those opportunities that are consistent with what's gone before. So when you asked the question, one thing that came to my mind was the George Floyd protests in the United States. It wasn't by any means the first time, that a black man had been killed by the police. But what was a little bit different in this case is that there had been a lot of people organizing around Black Lives Matter in many cities for a couple of years before that. And they had been going to their city council meetings, and they had been looking for the city council members who thought more or less as they did. And they had been building alliances and networks and having face-to-face meetings with small groups of people. This isn't something you can do on Facebook. And it isn't something you can do in the streets burning tires. It's not something you can do in Tahrir Square in Egypt. You have to do it almost individual by individual, meeting with people, building coalitions, and it takes time and effort. But you're right that what happens in South Africa is people are vocal and they demonstrate actively until they realize they're not getting anywhere, and then they go home unhappy and disappointed. If that same energy could be turned into attending city council meetings, sitting face-to-face with city council members, talking through the city budget with those city council members, talking through the capital improvement plans with those council members, assembling a group of your neighbors to go talk. Local democracy takes hard work, and it won't happen by itself, and it won't happen through national efforts. It'll happen through people organizing off of Facebook for sustained effort, is my view.
I hear you. It's not a Twitter moment. It's
not a Twitter thing.
It's much more deep than that. It takes serious commitment. I think one of the most interesting things is that we've got some of the most transparent budgeting systems in the world, and we win those prizes regularly. Yet it doesn't percolate back into
transparent, but not participatory.
Yes. I hear you.
Transparency is good, but participation makes the difference.
Even better. Jeet, I see your hand is up. You want to come in? You are muted, Jeet. You must unmute yourself.
I've just done. Hi, Jeanette. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Jeet.
Loaded question. Should Treasury have more or less conditional grants?
They should eliminate them completely.
Okay.
Take all of that money, put it into the equitable share, and spend their efforts insisting on sound financial management rather than micromanaging how councils are spending their money.
Which comes to my second question, because the reality is that even if you move the money in conditional grants or into Treasury and you give it to them in the form of equitable share, if the municipality doesn't have the capability, not just the capacity, I think the overall environment to actually handle this money, is it just simply not throwing good money after bad?
Well, I guess I believe in communities. I believe that communities who have resources can accomplish great things. I think South Africa, with its level of literacy and, as Renette said, activism, if people really understood how much money was in the hands of the city councils and they took it on themselves to oversee those city councils and to participate with those city councils, there's never any such thing as capacity in the abstract. You build capacity by doing things. And, what I'm proposing is a radical solution, but remember, these conditional grants were never part of the architecture. They were imported from the provincial sector. Provinces don't have their own revenue sources. They don't borrow for themselves. Municipalities were always meant to be sort of like the civic sector during the struggle. There was a strong civic sector in South Africa, and sort of when the revolution came, everybody says, okay, now we're in charge. We don't need to do this anymore. when in fact I would argue that was the time to make sure that you engage strongly with the local governments and continue. And you see people doing this in various places in South Africa. There are people who are actively working in this way to change local policy. You know, one of the successes that comes to mind a couple of years ago was in Cape Town when the city was trying to sell that school site that the community thought would be better used for housing, and eventually they were able to set it aside.
No,
That's the level in which you engage.
Matt, I mean, I really, really enjoy your statement about you know, or at least I'm going to now paraphrase you, something around capacity doesn't exist in the abstract. And I most strongly believe that people find capacity when they are held accountable. You don't know what capacity you need until you are told, go this direction, I'm going to hold you accountable. And I think that accountability component is something that I find interesting. We've got two other people with hands up, Selo Mashaba and then Andrew Donaldson. But Selo, you were first.
Thanks, Ronette, and hi.
Hi, Selo.
Let me just put my camera on. Yes, just a quick one from me. I wanted to get your take on, and I know you touched about it just a little bit, your thinking around indirect conditional grant. And I don't know if there's literature across the world just in comparison. But in this country, South Africa, we use them to circumvent what we're just speaking about now, capacity, where municipalities are not able to deliver. The initial thought was to say, let's create indirect conditional grants where other entities, including national government, can deliver on behalf of municipalities while they are solving their issues. I'm not too sure if that is helping the cost in the long run for municipalities, but just what's your take? There's been a proliferation of that recently, and I'm not too sure if, where are we going with this? Thanks.
Yeah. Look, many countries have tried this. I mentioned in India that they had attempted to decentralize, and the state governments, fearing that there wasn't capacity in the municipalities, created these indirect grant things, to use the South African terminology. They created urban renewal authorities, whose job it was to, or urban development authorities, whose job it was to build the infrastructure and then turn it over to the municipality. The idea was they would be experts at designing, procuring, and deploying infrastructure, and then the municipality would just have to maintain it. Well, it's not maintained. You can imagine, again, this is the disconnect between who builds it and who maintains it. I remember very early in my years of coming to South Africa, I went to a presentation at what was then called DWAF, the Department of Water Affairs and Forestry. And they had this program for maybe a decade then, putting water points into rural areas throughout the country. And one of the presenters did a study where he had gone back and looked at the water points that had been installed over the 10 years, and 95% of them were no longer functioning. And it's because there was no local ownership. It wasn't their water point. Some expert from a national department had designed it and installed it, and then said, now you take care of it. And, you know, half the time the local attitude might be, well, you built it, you take care of it. Or the local attitude might be, if we had built it, we wouldn't have built it where you built it. I think that bypassing the local democratic process of project selection and oversight looks attractive in the short run, but ultimately leads to a lot of waste and inefficiency. So I'm a strong advocate for taking the time to get that local capacity built progressively, not overnight, and working on letting the communities decide what infrastructure they need rather than having somebody sitting in Pretoria decide what they need.
Strong words, Matt, strong words. Fighting talk. Matt, Andrew, next. Thanks.
Hello, and thank you very much, Matt. I very much enjoyed that you set it out very, very, very accurately, I think. And I just want to emphasize what you've said, but I don't think you're I don't think you're saying it strongly enough. And that is that we have institutional arrangements, the statutory arrangements, the structure of municipalities, their functions, and the financing arrangements, which are incentive incompatible. They don't work because they're not designed in a way that would lead to them working. And you've explained well and given some good examples of that, the way the conditional grants work, the assumption that these are national responsibilities and so not ours. I've listened to municipal council officials explicitly say that they think township renewal is a national responsibility, not theirs, because that's how the funding flows, and so they don't spend money, don't raise money for those purposes, which is just not a strategy for growth. It's not a strategy for development, and it's not a strategy for raising living standards. Citizen activism is not going to solve that problem. Citizen activism can get some things done in some places, but it doesn't solve that institutional problem. And good governance and rules are also not going to solve that problem. You can only solve that problem by changing the institutions. And a very large part of the system that has to change is the direct responsibility of the Treasury. There are large features, substantial features of the financial architecture that have to change if we want accountable and growth-oriented local government. And you know, we cannot say this strongly enough now. We're on the edge of a precipice. Community activism is not going to solve problems now. It's going to lead to more unrest. That's the trajectory we're on now. And the financial architecture has to change, or we're not going to reverse that trend. Tim?
Let me say.
You come in, Matt.
Okay. If I suggested that citizen activism by itself was enough, then I would certainly have misspoken. I think that you need two things. You need to enforce the laws that you have. You have very good financial management rules, but they're often ignored. You have very good rules about provincial and, if necessary, national intervention in municipalities in financial crisis. But we have around 100 municipalities that qualify for mandatory interventions, and we have a dozen interventions. You know, you have to have the political will to act where the local municipalities are not acting responsible. This goes to Renette's point about accountability. And you have to have the citizens actively involved. You need both sides.
I think, Matt, it's a very interesting debate. And before I go to the next people, I want to hear from Andrew, perhaps a little bit more around what you mean with the financial architecture. Do you want to elaborate that a little bit, Andrew? What are you proposing there? What are you talking about? Some shifts in the financial architecture that's within the purview of the Treasury space. You're in mute, Andrew. You automatically go to.
We do have to begin with, it seems to me, with the demarcation of functions and the wall-to-wall, the problem of the wall-to-wall municipalities, the sense in which cities cities kind of overcome it a bit because cities are cities, but smaller towns just are really important for growth and the distribution of opportunities. And that I don't want to give the impression that it's only about the financial architecture. There's clearly constitutional aspects there that are the responsibility of other departments and that need to be reconsidered. And the two-tier system doesn't work for us the way it's been designed. But the financing system simply reinforces all of that. So the presumption that that transfers compensate for the absence of a revenue base is understood by municipalities to be a fiscal financing mechanism that should allow services to be provided in the same way in rural areas or in dispersed settlements as they as they are provided in an urban setting. Well, that just isn't possible. It's not economically rational, and it means that the economic benefits of agglomeration are not going to be realized. In fact, people choose to live in dispersed settlements where they don't pay rates. So that's part of it. But centrally, it's about the revenue issue, and you have to change. So I agree with Matt that we should have a business tax, but I would also say that we have to make progress in growing the urban rate-paying base. You can't have towns, small towns in rural Transkei that are essentially still the same urban space, demarcated space, zoned space that was that was drawn in the 1930s, that are just not expanding the rate space and the part of the community that is contributing to taxes and contributing to own revenue. And municipalities, have, especially outside of the city environment, just don't think of themselves as raising their own revenue to pay for their own services. They are so reliant on national transfers. I've been saying for a few years now that municipalities are going to have to prepare for, and provinces are going to have to prepare for national government phasing down the municipal share, because it has to happen sometime. You can't indefinitely keep growing the local government share of the national fiscus. At some point, national ministers are going to say, hold on, we have responsibilities too. And in fact, right now, I would take half the municipal transfers and give it to the police as the first step in building a capacity to fight crime, because if we don't do that, we're also on a hiding to nothing. So there are parts of the budget framework and the way we distribute resources in between the spheres of government that's part of what I'm talking about in the financial architecture. So. You're muted, Renette.
This happens to all of us the best. I wanted to say that these are important and important considerations, and Matt, thank you for being part of this discussion and bringing it up. And thank you, Andrew. I mean, these are the big stories that we have to think about. These are the big issues that we have to debate, that we have to take seriously and have to rethink some of our approaches. Landiwe, I'm going to give you a chance. Matt, you're still here with us, I hope. And I think after Landiwe, we'll have to close this very interesting session. Thanks, Matt. Landiwe, up to you. Landiwe, I think you're on mute. If that, perhaps, let me just try. I see I can't unmute you. You must unmute yourself. There we go.
Yeah. No, sorry. Yeah. Thanks, Matt. I was wondering if you could comment more on borrowing, municipal borrowing, to be precise. You have mentioned what seems to be like obviously the hegemony of the DBSA. What is your sense? What normally would be the kind of conditions that other funders like the banks still need to, what conditions do they actually require to actually expand the municipal borrowing market? Because we know that outside the 6 metros, quite very few municipalities could borrow or certainly at the volume that would actually make sense to the private sector.
Thanks, Landiwe. I guess here's a thing. We tend to talk in shorthand. We say metros and outside of the metros. And in fact, the situation is a lot more heterogeneous than that. We have, 5 metros that are in pretty good shape. And then if you go down to the intermediate city municipalities or secondary cities, depending whose vocabulary you're using, there's probably at least another dozen that have serious infrastructure needs and the financial capacity, if they choose to exercise it, to meet those needs. The the experience really in South Africa has been, it's interesting because it's different than in some other countries. There hasn't been a clear articulated demand from the cities that, hey, we need more capital and we're willing to borrow to get it. There are municipalities like eThekwini that could afford to borrow a great deal more than they do, and perhaps could really leverage their unique position on the coast of Africa in terms of global shipping and so on. There are municipalities like Drakenstein and Umhlatuzi that have pretty strong finances and could be borrowing a lot more than they are in order to lay the foundation for economic growth and development. Drakenstein's actually an interesting case because they did borrow aggressively 4 or 5 years ago, and then the expected development didn't happen and they got themselves in a bit of a tight spot. But I'd much rather see more municipalities taking that kind of a risk. The thing is that you take a bigger risk when you borrow from a bank, because a bank is going to give you sort of a 7 to 10 year loan. What you really want to be doing systemically, and Treasury is thinking about this a lot, how to attract more money from things like pension funds and life insurance companies that have long-term obligations and therefore need long-term investments. If you have a given amount of money available to service debt, and you do that over 7 years, you're going to build maybe a third the infrastructure you could build if you finance it over a longer time. So another part of this is to get a more active secondary market. And when the DBSA does a loan in the form of a loan, it's immobile, it sits in their treasury. If the DBSA would be doing their transactions in the form of municipal bonds, then they could keep them in the treasury until such time as they needed to recapitalize or they thought the market was ripe and they could trade them into the market. There's a really active sovereign bond secondary market in South Africa, but almost all municipal bonds that are out there, and there's not enough out there, are held to maturity. So having an active secondary market has always been part of the vision, but you need a critical mass of bonds to get there. And the DBSA lending in the form of loans is particularly damaging. If the DBSA were lending in the form of bonds, it would be much more helpful.
Wow. There you have it, Londile, from the mouth of the expert. Thank you, Matt. Thank you. This has been most interesting. And I think, in many ways, like a wake-up call for us again. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and insight. It shows when somebody has got the deep institutional knowledge. And I think it's very, very useful to bring you in here. It was wonderful to listen to you again. You've shared your extensive knowledge with South Africa for so many years. Thank you very much, Matt. Really appreciate that. And thank you to everybody that participated. I think it's time for Anita will make an announcement on the next little Friday afternoon seminar thing. Anita, you want to quickly come in, and then it's time to say goodbye. Anita?
Thank you all very much.
Okay, I'm going to go say thank you very much. It's great to have you here. Thank you all. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, everybody. We'll talk again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.